Imagine waking up one morning to the sound of boots on gravel. The sun isn't up yet, the air feels strange, and before your eyes have even adjusted, you can see silhouettes outside your front window, men in uniforms, stiff hats, and grim expressions. They don't knock. They don't need to. You already know why they're here. The radio's been buzzing for weeks now. Newspapers shouting headlines about Pearl Harbor. Whispers are on town getting sharper every day. You thought maybe it would blow over. Maybe people would come to their senses. But now, with soldiers at your door, you realize the truth. You're not just an American anymore. You're an enemy. That was how it began for over 120,000 Japanese Americans in 1942, most of them citizens born and raised in the United States. People whose only crime was the shape of their eyes and the sound of their family names. It's one of those chapters in American history that people like to skip over, because it hurts. It doesn't fit the clean narrative of the good war. But it happened. And it happened fast. Before we go deeper into this story, before we walk behind those barbed wire fences and feel the desert wind scrape against our skin, take a second to do something for me if you love stories like this. Stories that remind us how fragile freedom can be. Subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and share this video with someone who cares about history as much as you do. It keeps stories like this alive, and I promise you'll want to hear where this one goes. Now, let's step back in time to the winter of 1942. The bombs had barely stopped falling on Pearl Harbor when suspicion turned inward. Newspapers used words like treachery and sabotage. Politicians started calling for action against anyone of Japanese descent, regardless of who they were. Families who'd lived in California for 3 generations suddenly found their businesses vandalized, their neighbors avoiding them in the street. And then, on February 19th, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. That single sheet of paper changed everything. It gave the military the power to remove anyone from designated military zones, which just happened to include most of the West Coast. It didn't say Japanese by name, but everyone knew who it meant. Our story centers on one family, the Nakamuras. You could have found them in Los Angeles before the war, living in a small house near Boyle Heights. Father, mother, 2 children, Kenji and Eiko. He ran a produce business, she taught piano, and the kids spent their afternoons playing baseball with neighborhood friends. Just regular people living regular lives, until the posters went up. Instructions to all persons of Japanese ancestry, printed in big block letters. They were told to report to an assembly center with only what they could carry. No pets, no cameras, no radios, no weapons. The order didn't say how long they'd be gone or where they were going, only that they had to leave. Neighbors watched in silence as the Nakamuras packed their lives into suitcases. Kenji, just 10 years old, tried to bring his baseball glove, but it didn't fit. Eiko clutched a doll she wasn't supposed to take, hiding it under her coat. Their mother, Hannah, made sure to bring family photos, black and white memories of weddings, picnics, and Sunday dinners. Her husband, Satoshi, carried the framed portrait of his father, who had come to America in 1905 to build railroads. That photo was proof, at least to him, that they belonged here. When the bus arrived, soldiers with rifles stood at the door, checking names off a list. The family boarded quietly, joining dozens of others with the same dazed expressions. From the window, Los Angeles drifted away in a blur of power lines and palm trees. No one spoke for hours. The assembly center turned out to be the Santa Anita racetrack. That's right, a horse racetrack. The stables had been cleaned out, whitewashed, and lined with straw. That's where families slept. You could still smell the animals. Thousands of Japanese Americans were crammed there, while the government figured out where to send them next. People stood in long lines for food, for medical checks, for latrine buckets. Privacy vanished overnight. Hannah would later tell someone that the hardest part wasn't the smell or the noise, it was watching her children pretend not to notice the adults crying at night. A few months later, they were herded again, this time onto a train. The windows were covered so they couldn't see outside. Guards walked the aisles with their rifles slung low. After 2 days, the train stopped in the middle of nowhere. The desert stretched in every direction. That was their new home, Manzanar War Relocation Center. Manzanar. The word itself sounds almost poetic, doesn't it? But out there, surrounded by barbed wire and watchtowers, poetry died quickly. Rows of tar paper barracks baked in the sun by day and froze at night. Dust seeped into everything: the food, the bedding, the air. The Nakamura's were assigned to Block 14, Barrack 3, Room 2, one single room for 4 people. The walls didn't reach the ceiling, so you could hear every cough, every argument, every whispered prayer from the families next door. They tried to make it home. Hannah hung a sheet to divide the sleeping area. Kenji found scrap wood and built shelves. Eiko drew flowers on the walls with colored pencils someone had given her, but no amount of effort could change what they were. Prisoners, American citizens, behind barbed wire, guarded by American soldiers. Outside, the Sierra Nevada mountains loomed, and the distance close enough to see but too far to reach. Kenji used to stare at them for hours, imagining that if he could just climb high enough, he'd see Los Angeles on the other side. Sometimes he'd wave toward the mountains, half hoping someone out there might wave back. Life in camp fell into a rhythm, as strange as that sounds. The War Relocation Authority organized schools, work programs, even newspapers. People grew vegetables in makeshift gardens, held dances, built churches. They tried to reclaim dignity in a place designed to strip it away. But there was always tension. The older I say the immigrant generation tried to keep traditions alive, while their American-born children, the Nisei, were torn between loyalty to their parents and loyalty to the country that had imprisoned them. Satoshi worked as a carpenter, earning $19 a month. Hannah taught English in the camp school. Kenji joined the Boy Scouts. Eiko took piano lessons on an old upright that someone had salvaged from a nearby town. Little by little life resumed, though it was never normal. Every meal came from the mess hall. Every trip outside required a pass, and every night, the searchlights swept over the barracks like ghosts. You might think resentment filled the air, but it wasn't that simple. Some people were angry, yes, bitter and broken. Others clung to hope, believing that this would all end soon, that America would come to its senses. There were even young men who volunteered to fight for the U.S. Army from inside those camps. Can you imagine that? Fighting for a country that had locked up your family. Yet thousands did, joining the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, one of the most decorated units in World War II. They fought in Italy and France and the Vosges Mountains. And every time they returned to camp on furlough, people would cheer them like heroes, because they were still back in Manzanar. Fear never left. Rumors spread of informants, of people accused of being too loyal to Japan, of protests crushed by guards. There was a riot once, in December 1942, after a man was beaten for speaking out. Soldiers opened fire, killing 2 and wounding many. After that, the silence in camp became heavier. People learned to keep their heads down, their voices low. One night, Satoshi told his son Kenji, "Remember this. They can take your freedom, but don't let them take your heart." Kenji didn't fully understand then, but years later, he'd remember those words every time he saw a flag, And that's what's remarkable about stories like these. They're not just about what people lost, but what they held onto. Dignity, family, hope, even humor. Hannah once told a friend that laughter was her way of fighting back. Every Sunday, she'd gather a few families in the mess hall and tell jokes she remembered from before the war. For a few minutes, they could almost forget where they were. By 1944, things began to shift. The war was turning. The government started allowing some internees to leave if they had jobs or sponsors outside the exclusion zone. Some left for the Midwest, for Chicago or Denver. The Nakamuras stayed, waiting for the day they could return home. But when the war finally ended in 1945, and the gates of Manzanar opened, what they found outside was not the same world they'd left. Their house in Los Angeles was gone, sold off, their store vandalized. Some of their neighbors wouldn't even meet their eyes. It took years to rebuild, and even longer for the bitterness to fade. But they did rebuild. Kenji grew up to become a teacher. Eiko became a nurse. And Hannah, she never stopped playing piano. Now, before we continue deeper into what life was really like inside those camps, the day-to-day survival, the small acts of rebellion, the quiet strength of families like the Nakamuras, take a quick moment, if you haven't already. Subscribe, drop a like, and tell me in the comments what you think you'd have done in their shoes. Would you have stayed calm, fought back, or tried to escape? I'd love to hear your thoughts, and it helps this story reach more people who might not know it ever happened. The days inside Manzanar soon bled into one another, until time itself seemed to lose its edge. The morning bugle would sound at 6, sharp and metallic, echoing across the valley like some military command no one had volunteered for. The Nakajimas would stir under their rough wool blankets, brushing off the fine dust that always found its way through the cracks in the walls. It didn't matter how tightly you sealed the boards, or how carefully you stuffed newspaper, and the gaps. The Owens Valley wind was merciless. It carried sand into their food, their hair, their lungs. Sometimes, it even coated their dreams. The desert had a way of reminding you that you didn't belong there. Breakfast was powdered eggs, canned peaches, and coffee so bitter that even the adults sometimes winced. Children got milk if the kitchen had enough that day. Everyone ate in the communal mess hall, a long barrack with rows of wooden tables, tin trays, and the ever-present hum of tired conversation. People lined up with metal plates clattering in their hands, waiting for a scoop of something warm, something that at least felt like a meal. Privacy was gone. Dignity, too, had to be quietly redefined. Masao tried to make the best of it. He was 14 and full of restless energy, the kind that made confinement unbearable. He'd look out past the barbed wire toward the distant Sierra Nevada peaks, white and jagged against the deep blue sky, and dream about climbing them someday beyond the watchtowers, beyond the guards. Sometimes he'd sneak out near the perimeter fence to throw pebbles at the fence posts, pretending each clang was a crack in the invisible cage holding them all. His mother scolded him for it, worried sick, but his father didn't. Hiroshi understood. You can't crush a boy's spirit entirely. Even in a camp, you can only try to guide where it goes. At night, the desert cold would creep through the walls like a ghost. The family huddled together under thin blankets, whispering about the days before the war, about their grocery store in Fresno, the smell of fresh oranges, the neighborhood customers who'd suddenly stopped saying hello. I missed her piano most of all. It had been left behind in the rush to evacuate. And sometimes she'd hum the melodies she used to play, her soft voice carrying over the wind like a memory refusing to die. Now and then, they'd get letters from friends outside. Most were sympathetic, though some were laced with pity. One came from a family who'd once bought vegetables from the Nakajima store. They said they hoped the situation would be resolved soon. But there was always a careful distance in the words, as if fear itself had crept into the ink. Even pen and paper weren't free from suspicion in those days. Manzanar wasn't the only camp, of course. There were 10 major ones scattered across the country: Tule Lake in California, Heart Mountain in Wyoming, Topaz in Utah, Gila River in Arizona, Post and Jerome, Roa, Grenada. Many Doka names that sounded almost poetic until you realized they were places built to hold American citizens behind fences. Over 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry were sent there. 2/3 of them were born in the United States. The government called them evacuation centers, but let's not dress it up. They were prisons. Now, history books will tell you the camps were meant for national security, that there was fear of espionage or sabotage after Pearl Harbor. But when you dig into the records, declassified reports, military memos, you find that not a single case of sabotage by Japanese Americans on U.S. soil was ever proven. It was fear, pure and simple, fear and prejudice, wrapped in the flag. The FBI had already identified and detained anyone remotely suspicious. The rest, ordinary shopkeepers, farmers, teachers, children like Masao and Aya. They were swept up in a tide of hysteria that democracy couldn't quite restrain. Inside Manzanar, people found ways to hold onto pieces of their old lives. Men built gardens in the desert, shaping ponds and rock arrangements from whatever they could find, trying to reclaim a bit of beauty amid the dust. Women formed sewing circles, making clothes out of army issue fabric. Kids played baseball with makeshift bats carved from scrap wood. It's strange how humans adapt, isn't it? Even in a cage, they'll find a way to decorate the bars. One day, a photographer arrived in Sel Adams, the famous landscape photographer. The government had invited him to document life in the camps. He took portraits of the internees, capturing faces of quiet dignity, families standing proudly before their barracks, children smiling despite everything. Some critics later accused Adams of sanitizing the camps, of making them look too peaceful, but others saw his work differently. He wanted to show their humanity the way people refuse to be broken by circumstance. It's hard to judge a man's intent when he's staring down the weight of history with a camera instead of a gun. Meanwhile, tensions grew inside the camp. There were rumors of informants, people reporting to the administration about so-called troublemakers. Arguments erupted between those who believed in cooperation and those who demanded resistance. In December 1942, Manzanar exploded literally. A protest turned violent after the arrest of a popular inmate accused of being an agitator. Military police opened fire. 2 men were killed, many were wounded. The administration called it a riot, but for those who lived through it, it was something deeper. A moment when the illusion of calm cracked, revealing the anger that had been simmering just beneath the surface. That night, Masao couldn't sleep. He kept hearing the gunshots echoing in his head. His mother cried quietly in the dark, holding Aya close. Hiroshi sat by the window, staring out at the floodlights sweeping the camp perimeter. He whispered, almost to himself, "We built this country with our hands, and now our own country guards us with guns." It was the kind of line that sticks with you forever. Months passed. The seasons changed, but the fences stayed the same. Letters took weeks to arrive, and the newspapers were censored. When news came of the Allied victories in the Pacific, the camp erupted in cautious hope. Maybe it would all be over soon. Maybe they could go home. But what did home even mean anymore? Their farm was gone. Their store was gone. Their neighbors had moved on. For many Japanese Americans, home had become a memory of something that no longer existed. One day in 1943, something unexpected happened. The U.S. government handed out a loyalty questionnaire. Every adult was required to answer it. Two questions in particular tore communities apart. Question 27 asked if men were willing to serve in the U.S. Army. Question 28 asked if they would swear unqualified allegiance to the United States and forswear any allegiance to the Japanese Emperor. For citizens who had been born in America, it was offensive. For immigrants who weren't legally allowed to become citizens in the first place, it was impossible. Families split over how to respond. Some answered yes to both, desperate to prove their loyalty. Others answered no out of protest or confusion. Those who refused were branded no-no boys and sent to Tule Lake, which became a segregation camp for the so-called disloyal. You can't imagine the pain that caused. Brothers divided. Friends turned against each other. All because of 2 lines on a piece of paper written by men who'd never lived behind barbed wire. Hiroshi filled out his form carefully. Yes to both. He didn't do it for himself. He did it for his children. He wanted to believe that someday, when Masao and I walked free, no one would question where they belonged. And sure enough, the very next spring, recruiters arrived at Manzanar. They were forming an all-Japanese-American combat unit, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. Their slogan would later become legendary, "Go for broke." Over 9,000 volunteered from the camps. Think about that for a moment. Men who'd been stripped of their rights, who'd seen their parents herded into barracks, still volunteered to fight for the very country that imprisoned them. Masao watched them march off one morning, their uniforms crisp, their faces steady. He was too young to join, but he promised himself that when he turned 18, he'd prove himself, too. That day, something shifted in him. It wasn't blind patriotism, it was defiance, a refusal to let hate define who he was. Years later, the 442nd would become one of the most decorated units in U.S. military history. They fought in Italy, France, and Germany, rescuing trapped battalions, charging through gunfire, earning thousands of medals. Yet even as they bled for America abroad, their families still lived behind fences at home. That contradiction hung in the air like smoke that never quite cleared. If you're still watching and feeling the weight of this story, take a second to breathe. This is the part of history that too few people talk about, and it matters that you're here listening. So, if you haven't yet, hit that subscribe button, drop a like to help this story reach more people, and leave a comment about what part of this strikes you the hardest. Your engagement keeps stories like this alive and ensures they're never forgotten. By late 1944, the war was shifting. The tide that once drowned the Pacific in fear had begun to recede. Names like Saipan, Light, and Iwo Jima filled the newspapers, each one a hard-won piece of ground soaked in blood. For the Nakajimas inside Manzanar, the news came in fragments, whispered between barracks or posted on the communal bulletin board. Radios were banned, newspapers censored, and rumors often filled the silence. One day someone claimed the war would be over by Christmas. The next day, another swore Japan was preparing to invade California. The truth was always somewhere in between, muddy, distant, unreachable. Hiroshi spent more time at the camp's carpentry workshop, building chairs and tables from scrap lumber. He said it kept his hands busy, but it was really his mind he was trying to keep steady. When you're forced to live behind a fence for years, the smallest acts of creation become rebellion. I helped in the camp's hospital as a volunteer, bandaging cuts, fetching water, comforting sick children. She'd grown from a shy 11-year-old into a young woman, her voice calm, her movements graceful. There was something quietly heroic about the way she carried herself, as if she refused to let the camp decide who she would become. Masao, now 17, worked in the mess hall by day and studied by night. The camp had makeshift schools, with volunteer teachers. Some were university professors who'd also been interned. One of them, Mr. Watanabe, had once taught literature at UCLA. He lent Marcel a tattered copy of The Grapes of Wrath. The irony wasn't lost on him, an American classic about displaced farmers struggling through injustice. Read Behind the Wire by a boy labeled an enemy. Marcel devoured it. He saw his own reflection in those pages, ordinary people clinging to dignity while the world stripped it away. Outside the camp, change was brewing. Civil rights lawyers had begun to challenge the constitutionality of the internment. Fred Korematsu, Gordon Hirabayashi, and Minoru Yasui, 3 Japanese Americans who refused to obey the evacuation orders, had taken their cases all the way to the Supreme Court. The government, determined to defend its actions, argued that internment was a military necessity. The court, bound by wartime fear, upheld it. It was a stain that would take decades to even begin to fade. But inside those fences, life went on in slow defiance. Weddings were held, babies were born, there were baseball tournaments, church gatherings, even art exhibitions. The human spirit, I've learned, has a strange resilience. It finds cracks in even the strongest walls. Then, in August 1945, everything changed in a flash brighter than the sun itself. News reached the camp that the United States had dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The announcement came over loudspeakers, and the camp fell silent. Some wept openly, others sat motionless, their thoughts drifting across the ocean to relatives whose fates they might never know. For many, it was the first time they truly felt torn between two homes, one that imprisoned them, and another that was now reduced to ash. Days later, Japan surrendered. The war was over. The guards began packing up. The watchtowers were left unmanned, and the government finally announced that the camps would close. You'd think that would bring joy, but for most families, it brought confusion and fear. Where would they go? Their homes were gone, their businesses sold, their bank accounts frozen years ago. Some had nowhere to return to. The Nakajimas received their release papers in early September. Each adult was given $25 and a one-way train ticket to anywhere in the United States. That was the government's way of saying welcome home. $25 for 3 lost years. I folded her paper neatly and slipped it into her pocket. Hiroshi didn't say a word. The day they left, Monzano was strangely quiet. Dust swirled across the empty barracks, the sound of footsteps muffled by years of routine. Some families hugged each other goodbye, unsure if they'd ever meet again. Others burned old papers and letters, afraid of what might follow them outside the fences. I turned for one last look at the camp, the guard towers, the barbed wire glinting under the sun, and whispered something only she could hear. Then they stepped onto the bus, bound for a country that had forgotten them. Their first stop was Los Angeles. The train pulled into Union Station, and for a moment, it felt like returning from exile. But the stares from strangers reminded them otherwise. Signs in shop windows still said no Japs. Landlords refused to rent to them. Jobs were scarce. I overheard a man mutter under his breath as they passed, "Why'd we let them out?" The war was over, but the prejudice lingered like smoke after a fire. The Nakajimas stayed at a church in Little Tokyo that had turned its basement into a temporary shelter for returning families. Volunteers, mostly Quakers and local activists, helped them find food, clothing, and small jobs. Hiroshi took work repairing furniture. I cleaned offices. Masao, ever restless, decided he wanted to go east to Chicago, where he'd heard Japanese Americans were being hired in factories and some universities were accepting Nisei students again. His parents hesitated, but they knew he needed to find his own path. So one cold morning in 1946, he boarded a train alone, carrying nothing but a suitcase and a worn copy of The Grapes of Wrath. Chicago was different. People there didn't ask too many questions. They'd heard of the camps, sure, but the war felt far away now. Marcel found work at a machine shop and took night classes at a local college. He sent money home whenever he could, though home was now just a rented apartment in East LA. Slowly, the Nakajimas began to rebuild their lives not as victims, but as survivors. In the years that followed, stories like theirs faded from the headlines. America wanted to move on, to celebrate victory, to rebuild, but for Japanese Americans, rebuilding wasn't about victory, it was about reclaiming identity. Some changed their names, some tried to blend in, to forget, others refused to let silence bury the truth. They organized community groups, wrote memoirs, lobbied Congress. Step by step, they turned memory into movement. One day, years later, Marcel stood before his college class giving a speech on the Constitution. His voice trembled as he spoke about freedom and equality, not as abstract ideals, but as things he had lived without. When he finished, the room was silent. Then someone started clapping. That sound applause. Acceptance was something no god tower could ever contain. Meanwhile, Hiroshi and I had saved enough to open a small grocery store again, this time in Boyle Heights. Business was slow at first, but neighbors began returning. One old woman, who'd refused to speak to them before the war, came in one morning and said softly, "I'm sorry." Hiroshi just smiled and handed her a bag of apples. No bitterness, just quiet grace. Years turned into decades. The camps became history lessons, the kind most schools skipped over. But every time the desert wind blew through On's valley, it carried whispers of the lives left behind, the gardens, the laughter, the protests, the resilience. The barracks were dismantled, but the memories refused to die. And then, in 1988, over 40 years after the last camp closed, Congress finally passed the Civil Liberties Act. It was a formal apology. The U.S. government admitted that the internment was not justified by military necessity, but was instead driven by racial prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. Survivors were given $20,000 each in reparations. Some cried, some laughed, others said nothing, because how do you put a price on lost years? Marcel, now a teacher himself, read the news in disbelief. He called Aya that evening. They didn't talk much, just silence, broken by a single shared truth. Justice had come late, but it had come. I lived long enough to visit Manzanar again. It had become a historical site, preserved so future generations could see what fear had built. She walked along the old paths, past reconstructed barracks and the cemetery monument with the Japanese word Ire-to, soul-consoling tower. She stood there for a long while, her hand resting on the cool stone, and whispered her parents' names. Then she smiled, faintly, as if she could finally breathe again. Stories like theirs aren't just about history. They're about a soul of us and how easily fear can turn us against our own neighbors, but also how humanity finds a way to bloom even in the most barren soil. If you're still here listening, that means this story moved you. Take a second to subscribe, drop a like, and share this with someone who thinks they know American history. Because this, right here, is the kind of truth that needs to live in more hearts than it does in textbooks. Comment what you felt during this part, the quiet pain, the hope, the unfairness, and let's talk about it. Now, as the years move forward and memories begin to fade, let's follow Marcel into the later chapters of his life when the shadows of Manzanar never quite left him, but instead shaped the way he saw freedom, family, and what it truly means to belong. Marcel used to say that freedom feels heavier when you've once lost it. It's not the sort of thing you ever take for granted again. Every time he walked into a classroom, chalk in hand, he'd glance at the American flag hanging above the blackboard and take a quiet breath. He didn't see it the way others did, not just as a symbol of pride, but of contradiction, of hard-won hope tangled with painful memory. The stars and stripes reminded him of two Americas, the one that locked his family away, and the one that later apologized for it. He chose to live believing in the better one. In his early 30s, Marceau began teaching history at a small high school in Chicago's South Side. It wasn't glamorous, but he loved it. His students came from all over: Irish, Polish, Black, Latino, and most of them had never heard of the internment camps. When he told them that over 100,000 Japanese Americans had been imprisoned by their own government, some laughed at first, thinking he was joking. Others sat in stunned silence. He'd tell them about the dust storms, the guard towers, the way his mother would hum to keep her hands from shaking as soldiers searched their luggage. You could see the weight of realization fall on the room, like a curtain dropping between past and present. He didn't tell those stories to shame anyone. He told them because memory is fragile. If you don't tend it, it dies quietly. And when memory dies, injustice can grow again. WWII, now living back in Los Angeles, spent her days volunteering at the Japanese American National Museum once it opened. She guided visitors through the exhibits, pointing out old photos, ID tags, and the narrow wooden cots that families had slept on in the desert. One afternoon, a little girl asked her, "Why didn't you just leave?" I smiled softly and said, "Because sometimes, even when you do nothing wrong, the world decides to fear you." The child didn't say another word, but held Aya's hand all the way through the exhibit. That quiet moment, Aya later said, felt like a prayer being answered. Their father, Hiroshi, had passed years before that heart failure, the doctors said. But those who knew him believed it was more from exhaustion, from years of carrying the invisible weight of shame that wasn't his to bear. On his gravestone, I had carved a single word beneath his name: endure. It was the word he used most often when things got hard. And maybe that's what defined the entire generation: endurance. Quiet, unflinching, often uncelebrated endurance. Marceau married a woman named Clara in 1955. She wasn't Japanese. She was Irish-American, from a family of working-class immigrants. Some people frowned at that interracial marriage was still taboo in many places, but neither of them cared. They met at a library, of all places, both reaching for the same book on Lincoln. They laughed about it, talked for hours, and never really stopped talking after that. Clara once told me that when she first heard about what Marceau's family had been through, she cried not just for them, but for what her own country had done to them. She said, "It's one thing to love someone. It's another to love the history that shaped them, even the parts that hurt." They had two children, Kenji and Laura, both born in Chicago. And for a long while, life was peaceful. The war was something that existed only in stories, not in their daily lives. But as Kenji grew older, around the time he reached high school, he began asking questions his father had never been ready to answer. "Dad, were you ever angry? Did you hate America for what it did?" Marceau would pause, set down his book or his cup of coffee, and say quietly, "I was angry, yes. But hate? No. Hate's just another kind of prison." Still, there were moments that betrayed his calm. Like the time someone spray-painted slurs on a Japanese grocery store in their neighborhood, decades after the war. Marceau drove by that night, parked his car, and quietly scrubbed the wall clean himself before morning. When Kenji asked him why he didn't call the police or tell the paper, Marceau said, "Because that kind of ugliness doesn't deserve an audience. It just needs erasing." By the 1960s, the country was changing fast. The civil rights movement had caught fire. Vietnam was dividing the nation, and young people were demanding truth from their elders. Masao found himself drawn to that energy, that insistence on accountability. He began speaking at universities, sharing his experiences alongside Black and Latino activists who saw parallels between the camps and segregation. Injustice wears many faces, he'd tell them. Sometimes it looks like a fence, sometimes it looks like a law. His words resonated, though he never sought fame. He just wanted to make sure no one forgot how fear can dress itself as patriotism. AYA, meanwhile, helped organize pilgrimages back to Manzanar. Every year, buses of former internees and their families would travel to the site, now quiet under the desert sun, to lay flowers, share stories, and remember. The first time Kenji joined her, he was 16. He didn't expect to feel much, just curiosity, but when he stood there among the old foundations and felt the dry wind on his face, he understood something and spoken about his family. The land itself seemed to hum with memory, a strange, aching beauty that carried both sorrow and strength. I took his hand and said, "This is where we found ourselves by losing everything." In 1976, President Gerald Ford formally rescinded Executive Order 9066, the order that had allowed the internment to happen. It was a small gesture, but symbolically enormous. Masao listened to Ford's speech on the radio and smiled, though there was sadness in it too. "Took them long enough," he said. Then he turned off the radio and went back to grading essays. That same year, the bicentennial celebrations swept across the country. Red, white, and blue bunting hung from every porch. And though Masao was proud of the progress America had made, he couldn't help but notice that the story of the internment still didn't make it into most history textbooks. So he decided to write his own. It wasn't a grand book, just a modest memoir called Beyond the Fence. He filled it with memories, not bitterness. It talked about his father's carpentry, his mother's kindness, the baseball games at Manzanar, the quiet moments of dignity in a place meant to erase it. He self-published it, printed a few hundred copies, and handed them to libraries, schools, and anyone willing to listen. He never made money from it, but that wasn't the point. The point was to give the truth a place to breathe. Clara typed the manuscript for him page by page, on an old Remington typewriter. She said sometimes she had to stop, because the words made her cry. It wasn't just his story, she told a friend later. It was America's growing pain put to paper. In 1983, the winds of justice began to shift again. A government commission, after years of investigation, released a report titled Personal Justice Denied. It concluded that the internment had been based not on real military necessity but on racism, wartime hysteria, and political failure. The report recommended that the government issue a formal apology and pay reparations to survivors. When Masao read that line, he closed his eyes and whispered. Finally, 5 years later, in 1988, President Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act. Each surviving internee would receive $20,000 and a letter of apology. It wasn't about the money. It was about acknowledgement. I received hers in the mail one afternoon and called Masao immediately. Her voice shook as she read the letter aloud. "We can never fully right the wrongs of the past, but we can acknowledge them." Masao said nothing for a while, then replied softly, "Maybe that's enough." Later that year, he stood in front of his class and held up the letter. "This," he told them, "is why history matters. Because memory has a way of taking the long road, but it always arrives. If you've been listening this far, don't forget to subscribe and share this story." It's easy to think history's over and done with, but it isn't. It lives quietly in the people who carry it. Drop a comment with your thoughts. What do you think America learned, or still hasn't learned, from this? And hit that like button if you believe stories like this deserve to be told. Now. As Massago grows older and his children begin to find their own place in a changing America, let's walk with him through those final years, the years when memory becomes legacy, and the ghosts of the desert finally find peace. The final stretch of this long, painful yet deeply human story. By this point in the war, the tides had shifted dramatically. Japan was collapsing under the relentless weight of Allied air raids, cities reduced to smoking ruins, food supplies cut off, morale disintegrating. But even as the empire began to crumble abroad, the people locked behind barbed wire in the United States still waited, still hoped, still wondered when they might truly be free again. It's hard to imagine that feeling, isn't it? To know the war is ending, yet to remain a prisoner in your own country, because of your ancestry, your name, the shape of your eyes. By late 1944, whispers began circulating through the camps. Germany might soon fall, Japan could surrender next. Yet even these rumors felt hollow after years of broken promises. Families like the Tanakas didn't dare celebrate. The winter winds were biting that year, rattling the tar paper walls, as if the camps themselves were restless, too impatient for the end. And then, in the summer of 1945, the world changed overnight. Hiroshima, Nagasaki, to blinding flashes of light, and suddenly the unthinkable Japan's surrender. People in the camps listened to the news crackle through the loudspeakers, stunned, disbelieving. Some wept quietly, others stood frozen, hands trembling, unsure how to feel. The war was over, but what now? What would home even mean after all this? When the government finally announced that the camps would close, there was no grand celebration, no apology, no ceremony, just a notice on the bulletin board. Pack up. You're free to go. Free to go. Those words hit like an echo in an empty room. The Tanakas had no house waiting for them, no savings, no job offers. Everything they'd owned before 1942 was gone or sold for pennies. And the places they once called home didn't want them back. Old neighbors glared when they returned. Stores refused service. Children were taunted at school. The war might have ended, but prejudice hadn't. Imagine walking back into your hometown after 3 years in a camp, only to find graffiti on your old store window that said "Go home, Jap." Imagine being told by your old employer that the position's been filled, even though it never was. The cruelty wasn't shouted, it was whispered, written, implied, subtle enough to escape headlines, but sharp enough to wound. Families like the Tanakas spent months sleeping in church basements or overcrowded relatives' houses, rebuilding one slow day at a time. And still, they rarely complained. They swallowed their anger because bitterness wouldn't rebuild a life. It took years for America to even begin to admit what it had done. Most people just wanted to forget. Newspapers stopped writing about the camps. Textbooks skipped them entirely. The story faded into the margins, but not for the ones who lived it, not for the children who'd grown up watching their fathers humiliated, their mothers forced to cook in freezing barracks. They carried those memories quietly, like folded letters tucked deep inside. Decades passed before the truth began to resurface. In the 1960s and 70s, as civil rights movements spread, survivors started speaking out. They shared their stories, their pain, their photographs. They demanded recognition, not revenge, but acknowledgement. And then, in 1988, nearly half a century later, the US government finally did what it should have done all along. It apologized. President Ronald Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act, offering a formal apology and modest compensation to surviving internees. The letter they received said, "We can never fully right the wrongs of the past, but we can take a clear stand for justice." For many, it was too little, too late. Some had already passed away, never hearing those words. But for others, it mattered deeply. It meant someone finally said, "We were wrong." What strikes me most when I think back on those times is not the cruelty, but the quiet strength of the people who endured it. The resilience, the grace, the refusal to let hate define them. Many of the young men who'd been imprisoned still volunteered to fight for America during the war, joining the famed 442nd Regimental Combat Team, the most decorated unit in U.S. military history. Think about that. Fighting and dying for a country that locked up your family. That's not weakness, that's faith. That's hope in its purest, hardest form. Years later, when the grandchildren of those internees visited the sites of those camps, they found only wind and dust. The barracks had rotted away, the guard towers long gone, but the ghosts remained: the laughter of children, the clang of mess hall trays, the sound of the wind whistling through barbed wire. One grandchild once said, "My grandparents never taught me to hate this country. They taught me to make it better." And I think that might be the greatest legacy of all. What's fascinating and tragic is how history can bend the truth to fit the times. During the war, the camps were described as relocation centers, as if they were just harmless villages. Even today, some still hesitate to call them what they really were: prisons. But the truth matters, even when it's uncomfortable. Because when a nation forgets what fear can make it do, it risks doing it again. And you can see echoes of it whenever suspicion outweighs compassion, whenever safety is used to justify injustice. That's why stories like this one must be told, again and again. The Tanakas eventually rebuilt their lives. They opened a small grocery store in Los Angeles, the same kind they'd lost before the war. It took years, but slowly, success returned. Their son became a teacher, their daughter a nurse. They never spoke much about the camp years, not because they forgot, but because they wanted to move forward. Yet sometimes, in quiet moments, they'd tell their grandchildren about the nights in the barracks, the dust storms, the guards who looked just as scared as the prisoners. And in those stories, there was no hatred, only remembrance. Now, as I sit here thinking about it, I can almost hear the echoes of that time, the shuffle of boots on gravel, the creak of the guard tower stairs, the murmur of families saying prayers in the dark. The camps may be gone, but the lessons are not. They linger in the silence between generations. They remind us that freedom isn't just a flag or a speech, it's a promise that must be kept even when it's hard, even when it's unpopular. If you've stayed with me this long, thank you. This story, like so many from that war, isn't easy to tell. It's not about heroes or villains, it's about ordinary people caught in the machinery of fear. But their endurance, their quiet dignity, their ability to forgive, that's what defines humanity. So if this story moved you, share it, talk about it, keep it alive, because the moment we stop remembering, we start repeating. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel, hit that like button, and tell me what you think in the comments below. Was justice ever truly served? What would you have done if it were your family behind those fences? I'd love to hear your thoughts. This has been a story about pain, endurance, and the fragile, stubborn beauty of hope. The world moved on, but the memory remains, a reminder that liberty, once lost, is never easily regained. And maybe, just maybe, that's why we tell these stories, so we never forget how easily freedom can slip away, and how precious it truly is.